All right, welcome back. We were doing November 2024, 2281 and 0455, variant 12. MCQ number 16. MCQ number 16 says a competitive industry becomes a monopoly. So initially it was a competitive industry in which there were a lot of business players, and now it is being replaced by a monopoly situation in which there is one large producer who's catering to the market. Now they're saying what is the most likely advantage for consumers. Now, how would consumers consider it as an advantage if initially there were lots of producers, if there were lots of suppliers, and now in replacement, there's only one single producer? A, consumer choice may increase. B, economies of scale may reduce prices. C says more goods may be produced. And D says prices may be set by market forces. Now, if we look at option A, it says consumer choice may increase. This is incorrect because when it's the market is being dominated by only a single supplier, so the consumer choice does not increase, it rather narrows down, right? So you will chop A off. C says more goods may be produced. No, not necessarily more goods may be produced because now the number of suppliers are reduced. So it doesn't necessarily tells us that more goods will be produced, right? The variety will shrink in other way if you look at it. So you'll chop C off because that's an incorrect response. D says prices may be set by market forces. That's absolutely incorrect. Why? Because when it's a monopoly situation, what's a monopoly? It's a price setter, right? It's not a price receiver, it's a price setter. The prices are being set by a monopoly because it's in such a situation in which it is the one that dictates the price to the market. The market is not led to in the hands of the market forces, rather the prices are determined by the monopoly, right? So you choke D off. Now, by elimination, we are left with option B. But if you look at the logic, it says economies of scale may reduce prices. That's correct. Why? Because a monopoly is a large producer. And when it's producing on a large scale, it can experience lower average costs. It can experience cost of production that would be very low. And it could then pass on this advantage to the consumer in the form of reduced prices. So, hence, the consumers would benefit from a situation in which the monopoly does not charge high prices, rather, it passes on its lower average costs in the form of slash prices to consumers. In that situation, it would be beneficial for the consumers. All right. So for MCQ number 16, the correct option is B. I hope it is clear. So we'll shade in B for MCQ 16. All right, now let's look at number 17. Number 17 says what will cause real GDP to rise in a country. Now notice what's the key term here. It's real GDP. Now what is real GDP? Real GDP is GDP that is accounted for inflation. The first thing that you should come into your mind whenever we are talking about real GDP is GDP that is accounted for inflation. This means what? This means that the output is growing in real terms. The goods and services are growing in real terms. Now let's look at the options. They are asking what would be the reason for the real GDP to increase, right? This is what the question is asking you. Nominal GDP rising at a faster rate than employment. No, nominal GDP rising faster than inflation. Yes, that's correct. That means what? We want the output of goods and services to rise at a faster rate than inflation, right? We want the outputs of goods and services to rise at a faster rate than inflation. We want the output of goods and services. We want the output of goods and services to rise output of goods and services to rise at a rate faster than the rate of inflation, right? So for 17, it has to be B. It has nothing to do with population and nominal GDP rising. Again, that's not talking about the real GDP. So you'll chop D off. It has nothing to do with the population. Whenever we're talking about real GDP, it always talks about keeping inflation in your mind. So for 17, it has to be C. All right. Number 18. Number 18 says, what is the money supply? Now, come on. Recall what do you mean by the definition of money supply? Money supply consists of all the money in an economy at any one time. It consists of all the money in an economy at any one time. So this will include what? This will include the notes, the coins, the current accounts, and also the deposit accounts, right? So all the money in an economy at any one time. Now keep that definition in mind, and now let's look at the options available. The total quantity of foreign currency available within an economy, not only the foreign currency, what about the coins and the deposits and the current accounts? So you'll chop A off. B says the total quantity of money available within an economy. Exactly, that matches with the definition. So for 18, it has to be B. It shaded B. But now let's look at the other responses. The total quantity of money issued by the central bank. So it's not only this money that has been issued. What about the money that's already being circulated in the economy? You did not consider that. So that's an incomplete definition. D says the total quantity of money available within the commercial banks. What about the money being circulated or held at foreign currency accounts? Right? So D is again, you see, it has to satisfy all the components of the definition. So C, D, A are all talking about incomplete parts of the money supply. When we are talking about money supply, we are talking about all the money in an economy at any one time. So this will include the notes, the coins, the current accounts held at commercial banks and concentrates on money uh, even in the deposit accounts as well, right? So for 18, it has to be B. 19. 19 says which macroeconomic policy is most likely to achieve economic growth and price stability at the same time. This means out of all these four options, choose that macroeconomic policy that addresses economic growth and price stability at the same time. That means we want economic growth to be attained as well as price stability. That means there should be no more fluctuations in the level of prices, the general level of prices in an economy. And at the same time, we also want economic growth. Now, what is economic growth? That's an increase in the productive potential of an economy in the long run. When the entire PPC shifts or when the entire PPC shifts outwards, right? More and more of goods and services are being produced. Let's say capital goods here and consumer goods here on the horizontal axis. So what do we want? We want the entire economy, the production PPC curve to shift outwards, right? So when the productive potential of an economy increases in the long run, right? When the output level increases in the long run, so that's economic growth. So we want to choose out of these four options, choose that policy which achieves economic growth and price stability at the same time. What is fiscal policy? A says fiscal policy is government expenditure and taxes. Fiscal policy is government expenditure and taxes. So now it's not necessarily that you will achieve economic growth at the same time. All right, so the government can be increasing its expenditure to achieve economic growth, right? Spending more to increase economic activity, but maybe the price could rise as a result of demand pull inflation. So not necessarily. Similarly, if you'll impose import barriers, so you're restricting the amount of goods or services entering into your country. So you will not be increasing economic growth, you'll be restricting it. So you'll chop B off. C says monetary policy. Monetary policy is again what? Money supply and interest rates. So if you are increasing money supply or you are reducing interest rates to increase the economic activity, so what happens? It could be possible that if you're increasing money supply, so economic growth might increase, but it might be leading towards what? Inflation, right? It could lead towards inflation, demand pull inflation, right? Uh, Again, price stability will not be achieved. But option D says supply side policy. Yes, supply side policy is the policy which at the same time you can achieve economic growth and price stability at the same time. Why? Because supply side policy measures are designed to increase the aggregate supply of goods and services and increase the productive potential uh, at the same time, right? Why? Because it includes policies such as improving education and training, and you are reducing your taxes and the benefits, and you are reforming trade unions, and you're encouraging privatization in order to achieve economic growth and price stability at the same time. So yes, it's under supply side policy that both economic growth and price stability can be achieved at the same time. That is why for MCQ number 19, the correct option will be D. The reason why I'm explaining you in detail is I want you all not to memorize it just for the sake of memorizing it. I want you all to develop that foundation, that level of understanding, so that you develop that concept. Understand it the logical way, right? You should know the reasoning behind the correct answer. This is what I'm trying to aim at. All right. MCQ number 20. MCQ number 20 says, what is the definition of economic growth? And we just discussed it in this MCQ, number 19 only. Economic growth is increase in the economy's productive potential or increase in the output of an economy in the long run. So now keep that definition in your mind. Increase in the level of a nation's output over time. Option number B, right? It cannot be increase in the general level of prices. That would be inflation. So that's incorrect. Option A is incorrect. C says increase in the level of total demand over time. That's again incorrect. D says increase in wages, interest, profits, and rent over time. That's incorrect. Economic growth is an increase in the productive potential when the entire PPC shifts outwards and there is amount of output in an economy grows in the long run, right? So it has to be B. All right, 21. 21 says what causes cyclical unemployment in a recession? Now, there are two key terms in this MCQ. A, recession. B, cyclical unemployment. First, tell me what is recession. First, tell me what is recession. Recession is a fall in the real GDP over 6 months or more. A fall in real GDP over 6 months or more. All right. Now they're asking cyclical unemployment. Now, what is cyclical unemployment? Cyclical unemployment is demand deficient unemployment. What is cyclical unemployment? Demand deficient unemployment. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that when there are fluctuations in the business cycle, when there's a dip in the business cycle, when there's a fall in the economic activity in an economy. So for a certain period of time, the demand for labor shrinks, right? The economic activity shrinks. The level of or the scale of operations reduces. So there's less of labor being demanded, right? When there is a dip in the economic activity, when there is a fall in the level of demand for a certain period of time, for that temporary period of time, so there means that less of labor would be demanded. As a result, people would be out of jobs for that temporary period of time because there's a slump in the economic activity. There's a fall in the level of business activities taking place in the economy during that period of time. Get my point? Now, they are saying what causes. So this means what would be the reason behind that demand deficient unemployment during that recession, right? Now, would it be first you need to identify? Would it be, now look at the options. Option says permanent decrease and temporary decrease. I'm not looking at the latter part of the equation. There are two parts in these responses. The first part talks about the permanent decrease and the temporary decrease. Before choosing the option, first tell me whenever we are talking about cyclical unemployment, does it refers to temporary unemployment or does it refers to permanent unemployment? Is it a permanent decrease or a temporary decrease? Yes, that's a temporary decrease. Why? Because what is a business cycle? When there are booms and what? There's a dip and a fall, right? So when the business cycle is in a dip, when you are in a dip situation, right? When there's a slump, there's a boom and a slump. So that's for a temporary period of time. After that, why? Because the economic activity is going to rise back again, right? After a certain period of time, the economic activity is going to go back to its normal position again. So it's a temporary decrease. So you'll chop A and B. Why? Because they both talk about a permanent decrease. So either it has to be C or either it has to be D. Now, let's look at the other part of the equation. Is it a temporary decrease in the demand for labor or is it a temporary decrease in the supply of labor? It's a temporary decrease in the Demand for labor. Excellent. Why? Because for a certain period of time, there has been a reduction in the demand for labor. Why? Because the economy is in a slump for that 6 month of period. Right? All right. So for 21, it has to be C. I'm glad you've understood my point. All right. 22. MCQ number 22 is given you a table, and this is the table shows government expenditure and revenue in selected years. So they've given year 1, year 2, and year 3, and they've given you government expenditure in billion dollars, and at the same time, they've given you tax revenue. So what situation is being depicted over here? Government expenditure and tax revenue. Exactly. They're giving you the budget situation over here. Government earnings by way of taxes and government spending by way of its expenditure. Now, look at year 1. $500 billion was being earned by way of tax revenue and $500 billion was being spent. So this means what? Budget was in a zero situation. All that you earned, you spend that. Year 2, what happened? In year 2, the government expenditure rose from $500 to $600 and the tax revenue fell. So the tax revenue fell and the budget expenditure rose. So a budget, how much was the government spending? 600. And how much was the government earning by way of taxes, both direct and indirect? 400. So there was what? You spent more than you earned. So there was a budget deficit. So there was a budget deficit of $200 billion. 600 minus 400. The government was earning 400. The government spent 600. So there was a budget deficit of $200 billion. Right? So there was a budget deficit of $200 million. What happened in year 3? In year 3, the government expenditure rose further from 500 to 600 to 700. So now the government is spending more. And what about the tax revenue? The tax revenue fell from 400 to 300. Now what's the difference? 700 minus 300 is what? 700 minus 300? 400. So there's a negative $400 billion budget deficit. So the budget deficit worsened. The budget deficit increased. Right? Now, let's look at the options. The option says the question is asking us what might explain the changes in the government's budget over the period. Now, they're saying what would be the reason why the government is now spending more and earning less. Or they're asking you what would be the reason why the budget deficit is increasing. Right? So far, you got the scenario in your mind. You got the situation in your hand. Right? Now, let's look at the options. A fall in the dependency ratio. Dependency is increasing or decreasing? The dependency is increasing. Why? Because now the government is spending more. So this means what? The unemployment might have been increasing. That is why you see you're earning less by way of taxes. The people might be unemployed, so you're getting less by way of direct taxes. They're not giving you income taxes. And you are spending more on unemployment benefits. So that is why your government expenditure is increasing. So the dependency ratio is not decreasing, it's increasing. So you'll chop A off. B says a fall in the exchange rate. Now, this question does not have to do anything with the exchange rate because we are talking about the budget here. We are not talking about international trade. You chop B. C says an increase in cyclical unemployment. Yes, that could be correct. Why? Because your tax revenue is decreasing. So you are earning less by way of taxes. So your tax revenue is decreasing. And the government is spending more. So when the government is spending more, this means what? It's giving more in terms of unemployment benefits. So 22 for C, it's correct answer. What about option number D? D says an increase in real GDP. Had there been an increase in real GDP, so the government would have been in a budget, not in a budget deficit, it would be in a budget surplus situation, right? So it's incorrect. So for 22, it has to be C. All right. Number 23. Number 23 says, again, it's a table being given, and they are saying it shows economic policies for 4 countries, A, B, C, and D. So A, B, C, and D are basically 4 different countries. Now they're saying which country is most likely to be following a policy of preventing deflation. Now, what is deflation? First tell me. Deflation is what? Negative inflation. Always remember, deflation is negative inflation. Now, what do you mean by negative inflation? That means a sustained fall in the prices of goods and services. A sustained fall in the prices of goods and services. Now, what is the question asking you? The question is saying which country is most likely to be following a policy of preventing deflation. That means it wants to avoid a situation in which there is negative inflation. It's trying to prevent that. Now, do not want a fall in the prices of goods and services to take place continuously. You do not want that situation, right? So, which country would be following that policy? Now, look at the money supply, look at government spending, look at taxation. First, you tell me, if an economy wants to avoid a situation in which the level of prices of goods and services is continuously falling, you do not want that situation. So, what should it do to money supply? It should be increasing it or decreasing it? It should be increasing it. So, you want money supply to increase. What about government spending? It should be increasing. What about taxation? You want taxation to decrease or you want taxation to increase? You want taxation to decrease. You decided it. Now look at the options. You want money supply to increase. Now look at the options. A says decrease, B says decrease. So you will chop A and B that moment only because they are both talking about decreasing. So you chop A and B. So you're now left with C and D. Now you want money supply to increase. C says increase, D says increase. All right, so good. You want government spending to what? Increase as well. Again, C is also saying increase, D is also saying increase. What about taxation? Option C says decrease, D says increase. So you chop D because D is saying we want taxation to increase. But no, we know that if you want to avoid deflation, if you want to avoid a situation of negative inflation, you need to decrease the level of taxation. So hence you need to satisfy all three parts, the money supply, the government spending and the taxation. And looking at that, option C is the correct response. So for 23, it has to be C. All right. I hope this is clear. Number 24. MCQ number 24 says workers in Switzerland earn more on an average than workers in Mexico. All right. So now the people who are employed in Switzerland are comparatively earning higher wages, they are enjoying higher earnings than people in Mexico. Now they are asking us what is a likely cause of this. Now they are asking us what could be the reason behind this. Why people in Mexico are earning less as compared to people in Switzerland. Let's look at the options. A says a greater percentage of workers in Switzerland work part-time than in Mexico. All right, if they are working part-time, so doesn't mean necessarily that they could be earning more. They are spending less hours working. It does not guarantee that part-time workers could be having higher earnings than people in Mexico, right? So you chop A. B says the average worker in Switzerland is more productive than the average worker in Mexico. That's the correct answer. That means efficiency. More output per labor is being produced, right? So this is the correct answer. 24 makes sense. 24 is logic. 24 is B. Let's look at the other responses as well. C says the average worker in Switzerland pays more income tax than average worker in Mexico. If it's paying more income tax, it would be having what? Less of disposable income. So it's negating your question. The question is saying that the person is earning more, but if you are spending more in taxes, so you'll be left with less disposable income. So you'll chop C. D says the unemployment rate is higher. So if the unemployment rate is higher, how could it be enjoying more income? It could be out of job, right? So you're negating the question. So C and D are both irrelevant. Hence, the correct answer is B. I hope it's clear. Number 25. MCQ number 25 is displaying us a table in which they've shown birth rate, death rate, and net migration. What is net migration? In which people coming into your country and people leaving out of your country. So there is a net of that. You subtracted the people leaving your country from the amount of people coming into your country. So it's immigration and immigration, the subtraction of that, right? All right. Now they've given you 4 countries: Australia, Brazil, Nigeria, and US. Now, the best way to answer such questions is you'll read the options and then decide which is the correct one. All right. Now, they're saying what can be concluded from the table? Option A, only one country, Nigeria, had a decreasing population. Now, we do not have any statistics for population. Do they give us the amount of population? No. So, we do not have any evidence. So, we cannot make any statement regarding option A. So, we'll chop A. B says the country with the lowest birth rate had the lowest death rate. Now, which country has the lowest birth rate? US. So now they're saying the country with the lowest birth rate had the lowest death rate. Which country is having the lowest death rate? Here it's Brazil, but they are saying the country with the lowest birth rate had the lowest death rate. If US has the lowest birth rate, it does not have the lowest death rate. It's Brazil that has the lowest death rate, so you will show B. It's incorrect. C says the country with the lowest death rate. Now, which country has the lowest death rate? Brazil. Now, they're saying the country with the lowest death rate, which means Brazil, has the highest birth rate. Now, does Brazil has the highest birth rate? No. Brazil has 14. The highest birth rate is in Nigeria, 39. So, again, this is incorrect. Right? Now, let's look at option D. Option D says the country with the lowest natural rate of increase in population was the US. The country with the lowest natural rate of increase. Natural rate of increase means by way of birth. So, the country with the lowest natural rate of increase. So, by birth rate, if you look at it, yes, it's US. That only has a rate of 12. Was the US? That's correct. So, for 25, it has to be D. What happened when you look at this question? You got overwhelmed. But the best way to answer such a question is answer it by way of looking at the responses. I hope I've made my point. Number 26. MCQ number 26 says, which combination best describes the characteristics of a high income economy? Now, there are two key terms in this question. They are saying best and they are saying the characteristics of a high income economy. Now, high income economy is what? That has what? The highest level of GDP per head, the highest rating in terms of HDI, and which employs the highest percentage of its labor force in the tertiary sector. Right? So we want what? We want the highest GDP per head. So we can chop C and D because they talk about low. We want the highest HDI. Again, A, B, both are talking about high and high. What about the percentage of labor force in the tertiary sector? That means in the services industry. Tertiary in the services industry. Right? It has to be high again. So the option that satisfies all three parts of the equation is A. Option A. We want the high GDP per head, we want the highest HDI ratings, and we want the percentage of labor force employed in the tertiary sector to be highest as well, right? What was HDI? The measure of living standard that takes into account income, education, and life expectancy, right? It's a measure of living standard that takes into account income, education, and life expectancy. So looking at that, for 26, it has to be A. Moving on, MCQ 27. MCQ number 27 says, what might encourage, so encourage is the key term, international specialization between countries. Now you want to identify a situation which promotes specialization. Specialization is what? In which each country does more and more of what it is best at doing, right? So what would be promoting international specialization between countries? Free trade, inefficiencies in production, labor mobility, tariffs. Now, if you look at B, C, and D, they all are negating it. If you'll impose more tariffs, if you'll increase more taxes, so the specialization will be promoted or de-promoted. It will be reduced. If the labor is difficult to be switching on between countries, so will specialization take place, more of that or less of that? Be less of that. If there are inefficiencies in production, if you're inefficient, if less output per labor is being produced, if there's more wastage, if there's less efficiency, so will specialization be taking place or not? It will not be taking place. So B, C, and D are all irrelevant. It's only when you've got free trade, when you're promoting more and more of trade, when there are no restrictions, when there are less, nearly negligible tariffs, then only specialization at an international arena would be taking place. So for 27, it has to be A. Moving on, MCQ 28. A government wishes to stop the dumping of a specified imported good at a very low price. Now, what is dumping? When countries, they sell goods at a very cheaper rate in order to destroy the market of that particular good in the competitive countries, right? So what could be a way in order to stop dumping? And whenever it talks about dumping, the best way is to import a ban on that. That means you are going to impose bans or embargoes. So looking at the options, apply an embargo to this good. That's the best way to do that. None of the other techniques which they mentioned, increasing interest rates, has nothing to do with imported goods dumping. Devaluing the currency, again, no. Providing subsidies to home producers of these goods, no, it won't work. The best way to avoid dumping is you'll impose bans, you'll impose embargoes to these goods, right? So for 28, it has to be A. Moving on, 29, MCQ number. The price of the US dollar in terms of other countries is set by the forces of demand and supply. So this means that you are determining the price of the country by way of market forces. So you are leaving it in the force of market. So when you're leaving something in the hands of market forces, what does it mean? It means it will be determined by what? It's a floating exchange rate. So exactly what does this statement refers? It refers to the determination of the exchange rate in a floating exchange rate. You've left it in the hands of the demand and supply, right? So for 29, it has to be C. MCQ number 30. All right. MCQ number 30 is a little detailed. So pay close attention to how I'm going to solve it. And then I'm going to show you why we are referring to the answer that is correct here. All right. All right. Now it shows a bar graph. It shows the value of a country's imports and exports of goods over 5 years. Now, the horizontal axis is displaying the year. The vertical axis is displaying export of goods and import of goods. Now look at the key. The white bars are displaying the exports. The grayish bars are displaying the imports. Right? Now, year one. Now look at year one. In year one, the white bar was showing what? The exports. Now, where are the exports hovering around? Almost a 20. And where are the imports hovering around 15? So exports are 20, imports are 15. So exports minus imports used to give us what? The balance of trade. So over here, if it's 20 of exports and 15 of imports, so the balance of trade would be what? A positive 5. Right? The difference is a positive 5. Just for the time being, write a positive 5 like that. Now let's move on to year 2. In year 2, now you tell me the exports of goods was again hovering around what? A 21. And here it could be around an 18, right? 18 and a 21. Maybe a +2 or a +3, right? For the time being, I'm just writing a +2, right? The difference between the two. If it's an 18 and a 21, a +2 or a +3. For the time being, I'm writing a +2. The balance of trade is +2. Now let's look at year 3. In year 3, it's again around a 25 exports of goods and the import of goods is around 24, right? So it could be a +1, the balance of trade. In year 4, what is happening in year 4? The exports of goods was around 30 and imports of goods roughly around 25. So it's a +5, the balance of trade, then exports minus imports. In year 5, what happened? In year 5, it's around 28 and this could be around 22 or something. I would say a +6. I'm not being too exact. I'm not being too precise. I'm just giving you a rough figure. It could be, let's say, a +6. All right. Now, we've got the balance of trade figures. Now, let's look at the question. They are saying between which 2 years, that means you want to find out between which 2 years did the country have an increase in the value of imports and an improvement in its balance of trade. Now, we have identified the figures for the balance of trade. But what about the value of imports as well? So now they want you to look at the options available and out of these options, pick out the correct one which satisfied both parts. We want the value of imports to increase. This means between those 2 years, the country should have been importing more, and we want the improvement in the balance of goods in as well. Now, look at it. Year 1 and 2. In year 1 and 2, now I'll erase these lines. In year 1 and 2, the value of imports. Now, if you look at year 1, the imports was what? The imports was around 15, but in year 2, the imports was around 18. The value of imports increased, but the balance of trade fell because initially it was 5, then it went to 2. So you will chop A. In B says between year 2 and 3. Now, if you look at 2 and 3, in year 2, the balance of trade was 2, but in year 3, the balance of trade was a positive 1. So the balance of trade did not improve, it fell. So you will chop B. In year option D says 4 and 5. So now if you look at 4 and 5, the balance of trade was 5. The in year 5, the balance of trade was 6. Yes, there was an improvement, but the import of goods, if you look at it, it was hovering around 25. But in year 5, the imports fell. So they did not improve. So you chop D. But it's only in option C in which they talk about year 3 and 4, in which the balance of trade improved from 1 to a positive 5. And the value of imports also rose because the value of imports was around a 24 and it went up to a 25. So it satisfies both of these parts. Hence, the correct option is C. So for 30, it has to be C. We'll shade that. I hope this is clear and you've understood all. Stay tuned, subscribe. We'll come back more.